IGN saying Resident Evil 5 can't be remastered is just odd to me. Like, I'm not sure if it's the fact that it's not a horror survival genre anymore like all the other Resident Evil, or just cause the fact they are just intimidated by Chris's masculinity. By being so fucking strong, he can fucking punch a boulder, and they're intimidated there won't be any women or men for them. But if they are doing the same trend that they have been doing, they'll probably put a buffer game and continue off where Resident Evil Village left off, unless they try to pull a Modern Warfare and just skip the buffer altogether. But at least Capcom's actually been absolutely killing it with all their games. So let us see why IGN thinks Resident Evil 5 can be remade.
With Resident Evil 4's release last year, Capcom's project to remake the glory years of its survival horror series is complete. But as the game's post-credit scene suggests, the remakes aren't over. And so the big question is, where next? The obvious answer is a remake of Resident Evil 5. But on the game's 15th anniversary, it's clear that moving forward chronologically will take Capcom's remakes into the series' weakest era, an era of gameplay and narrative decisions best left in the past. Resident Evil 5 simply can't be remade. At least not to the standards of Capcom's best work. And so the answer is not to remake, but to rewrite. Resident Evil is a survival horror series, not that you'd know that playing Resident Evil 5. Sure, it features a constant flow of horrific imagery, but Resident Evil 5 is an action game through and through. That's evident in its cover shooter mechanics, vehicle chases with on-rails turret sequences, and the constant rattle of assault rifles. Even its visual design evokes the sandy shades of modern military games that experienced mass popularity in the late 2000s. It all speaks to a series that had lost its way. Rather than reflect on the tenets that were the foundation of its experience, Resident Evil 5 looked to the contemporary gaming zeitgeist in an attempt to find a new lease of life. The result is an unholy hybrid of Resident Evil, Gears of War, and Call of Duty. It's as ugly and unwieldy as it sounds.
Now, while I do agree it does lose a lot of its core mechanics of originally being a horror survival game, but Chris is a military man, comes in prepared. For the most part. He's not like a dumbass who only brings one mag behind enemy lines like a fucking CERN idiot. Leon. Also, personally, for me and many others, we enjoy mowing down hordes of infected in video games. That's why I like games like Left 4 Dead, World War Z, and even the small chapter where you play Chris in Resident Evil Village was so satisfying. That's why Resident Evil is always a game I go back to and replay so much to get payback on all the enemies that made my first playthrough such a miserable time. But still fun. Now, these are some pretty harsh words in my opinion, considering IGN in the past gave Resident Evil 5 a 9 out of 10.
This design appears to not just be a misguided attempt to follow Western successes, but also a misreading of its predecessor. With Resident Evil 4, director Shinji Mikami deftly reinvented the series through the use of a new over-the-shoulder camera angle. The perspective allowed for a more kinetic, action-heavy game. Despite this, Mikami never lost sight of the terror at the core of Resident Evil. Through the use of enemies that were strategically placed to provide undulating waves of tension and fear, and the inclusion of Ashley as your vulnerable charge, combat encounters were focused on surviving overwhelming horrors rather than dominating foes. Resident Evil 5, meanwhile, presents its enemies as waves to be gunned down with increasingly powerful weaponry. Their purpose is cannon fodder, a wall of meat to slow your progress through levels. And those levels are not locations to be explored. Instead, they are largely funnels that push you from entrance to exit. Resident Evil 4 may have replaced the series' traditional continuous structure with discrete levels in an attempt to move away from the backtracking-heavy design of previous games, but it preserved the spirit of locations like the Raccoon City police station. The village, Salazar's castle, and the island feature interlocking, explorable pathways that solidify these locations as authentic spaces rather than obstacle courses. Resident Evil 5 has no interest in this, with the majority of its stages being little more than corridors peppered with dead ends to hide treasures in. Their lack of authenticity means no one will ever mention the Kajuju Autonomous Zone in the same breath as the Spencer Mansion. All this is to say that a faithful remake of Resident Evil 5 would break Capcom's 7-year streak of brilliant survival horror games. It's telling that the series' reset point, Resident Evil 7, was a reinvention of the very first game, a haunted house that grew ever larger as you unlocked new rooms by solving its puzzles. Clever reinventions of this base conceit is the key to Resident Evil's success, be that dropping an unstoppable force into the house's corridors, such as Resident Evil 2's Mr. X, or expanding the scope of the house. Resident Evil Village's titular location is effectively a giant manor. Its corridors are streets, and its rooms are houses. Resident Evil 5's stage-driven structure is simply inferior to this design. A modern recreation of it would only further highlight its flaws, especially coming in such close proximity to masterclasses like the remake of Resident Evil 2. Remakes can, of course, completely redefine the structure of their source material. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, for example, is recognisably an updated version of the classic RPG, but its world design and gameplay mechanics are a world apart from the 1997 original, and so you could argue that Resident Evil 5 is actually the Resident Evil most in need of a remake. A whole new environmental structure and scenario design that reins in the action and dials up the horror would bring it in line with Capcom's other remakes. But all of this doesn't account for Resident Evil 5's most notorious problem. Racism.
Huh? But that's what the population is like in Africa. A very chaotic and war-torn country. Like, why is it an issue now, but not in RE4, where we had all Spanish people? Resident Evil Village had all Eastern Europeans, and now we're in Africa. And now, because we're in Africa, it's a big problem.
Set in a fictional West African country, Resident Evil 5's primary antagonists are black people. Yes, it's technically the Ouroboros virus that protagonist Chris Redfield is fighting, but the parasite's host is depicted as a nation of mobs and primitives who are violent even before their infection. Intentionally or not, Resident Evil 5 positions Africa as the Dark Continent, an uncivilized world harboring a diseased population that needs gunning down via Western intervention in the name of global security. This insensitive treatment of people of colour was hotly debated even as early as Resident Evil 5's debut trailer.
But that's what the population is in Africa, not that they're all fucking... Hey, they're all chaotic and, you know, fucking savages, but it is a very chaotic and war-torn continent. Like, why is it a big issue now, but not in Resident Evil 4 when it was all Spanish people, Resident Evil Village when it was all Slavic, Eastern Europeans, but now because it's Africa, it's a fucking big deal.
Writers such as Ngai Kroll and Stephen Totillo pointing out the game's uncomfortable post-colonial imagery. The arguments and think pieces continued well into the game's release window, with IGN's own former editor-in-chief Hilary Goldstein having also wrestled with the subject. But that was 2009, a time when race was apparently a debate rather than a reality. In the 2020s, in a post-Black Lives Matter world, there is only one acceptable response to a white man shooting waves of Africans for an entire video game. No.
But did they forget about Sheva, the second main character in this fucking game, and the other African BSAA fucking members? Like what? Everyone's just gonna forget about them? I think my only problem with Resident Evil 5 is they didn't give Sheva more love. They did my girl dirty. After 5, they never mentioned Sheva again, and that's so bad. That's so disrespectful. I think a lot of people like Sheva. And right now, you're just trying to put out a narrative. You know, it's going to do bad for you, but yet you decided to put this out there. Have companies like IGN gotten so bad that they have to put out stuff like this so they could drive attention, despite not looking good? They're like a miserable child who needs attention from others. It's fucking sad. But you guys tell me, do you think Resident Evil 5 and 6 was so bad? Do you think they should completely redo everything? Comment, like, subscribe, you made it to the end. I'm gonna go play Resident Evil 5 just to piss off IGN.